Yes.
Fire away.
Yes. So welcome everyone to our book panel about the crisis of liberalism and the rise of illiberalism in Hungary, perspectives from political economy. We are very happy that so many of you have joined us for our panel today at this amazing conference. And we are all very grateful for you and for your joining this event, and of course to the organizers for putting this event together. And we'll start just briefly introducing the panel. Christoph will say a few words after me, and then Dawn will introduce the panelists, and then we'll continue with the book discussions. But just let me first say a few words about why we thought this would be a good idea to meet here and have this discussion. So probably we all agree that Hungary has been seen until recently as well, one of the most paradigmatic cases of illiberalism in Eastern Europe. And before Hungary has become this paradigmatic case of illiberalism, until the early 2000s, the country was seen as one of the lead reformers in terms of political and economic liberalization. And we thought that there is a really vast literature by now about the crisis of liberal democracy in Hungary. And we have learned a great deal about the social and economic and cultural and political dimensions of this de-democratization process. But there are also a few things missing, and there are a few things that the dominant narratives, we believe, overemphasize. And that we thought that there are a few books coming up representing, let's say, a new narrative, both about the transition years in Eastern Europe, the post-socialist times, and also about the foundations and the nature of the emerging new illiberal regime in Hungary, most importantly, but also offering insights into what's happening and going on in other countries in the region. So we assembled these four recently published books that all address the question of illiberalism from a culturally sensitive and multidisciplinary perspective, drawing on insights from political economy, economic sociology, and anthropology. And these books contribute to our understanding how the 30 years of capitalist transformation in Hungary is linked to the rise of the new right-wing cultural hegemony and the stability of illiberal rule in the country. So it's a case study linking very nicely into the overall topic of the conference, and I hope that this discussion will open up also new avenues for future research, not just among us, but I mean authors, but also with the audience and others continuing this new direction of critically engaged political economy research on illiberalism. So as I've said, thank you all very much for joining, and I hand the floor over to Christoph.
Thanks, Gabor, for the introductory comments. I really only have a very few comments regarding our logistics, and I'll give you the schedule of our panel. So what will follow now is just a few introductory remarks by Don Cobb. We'll take a few moments to introduce the presenters and say very few things about the books. And then we'll go into the presentation of the books themselves. And we'll all four of us try to stick to 10 minutes. So just beware, presenters, that we'll give you a signal around 10 minutes. And after 12 minutes sharp, we'll ask you to pass the floor to the next person. And then I'll pass the floor back to Don, who will ask a few questions, maybe pushing us, criticizing us, whatever comments he may have. And at 4 o'clock, or sorry, 5 o'clock Bucharest time, we will open the floor to your questions. And thanks a lot for being with us. I really also hope this will be a very fruitful discussion. So Don, fire away, floor is yours.
Thank you. So first of all, I should say that it is deeply impressive how this whole conference has come together. Our Romanian colleagues have done incredibly good work. I've been working on the region since the late 1990s, and for me to be spontaneous and honest is to say that this seems to me the moment of breakout. The intellectual maturity of what we're seeing here is fantastic. The same is true for the 4 books that we're looking at today. We concentrate on Hungary, an avant-garde case of illiberal transition or illiberal transformation. Of course, this is a global development. We talk here the region and we focus on Hungary, but we shouldn't forget that these are processes within global capitalism, and there are apparently not just histories that are important here, but there are clearly global relational mechanisms working that produce outcomes or are likely to produce outcomes like this, not necessarily. So we will be looking at, let us say, conjunctural perspectives within a sort of broader structural idea of neoliberal global capitalism, the inequalities, the class contradictions that it creates, and the potential alliances that emerge in response to that, confirmative or resistant to that. Now, those are the simple introductory words. I'm going to tell a little bit about the authors that are presenting their books today. I will do all the 4 of them, and then we move immediately to the presentation. So Attila Antal has PhD in political science. He's the only real political scientist here. That's actually interesting because what we do here is a little bit moving beyond the liberal critiques of illiberalism. It's something that has to be done, something that must be done within a broad political economy perspective, in which anthropologists are also deeply involved. Attila is the only real political scientist here. He's a senior lecturer at ELTE, Faculty of Law, Institute of Political Science. He also coordinates the Social Theory Research Group at the Institute of Political History. Well, his research on populism, social critical theory, theory of democracy, constitutionalism. He's also the editor of the very well-respected journal Esmelet. Well, you've heard Gabor already. Gabor is former member of the Hungarian parliament. He's now a Marie Curie Fellow at Bocconi University. We should be very happy that Gabor left politics. That's also true for Christoph Szombati. We need these guys in the thinking world, not in the politically reproductive world. So Gabor is at Bocconi University. He has an ERC at the moment, as far as I know. His research addresses the political economic determinants of inequality in health and well-being, and how these inequalities in their turn shape the evolution of democracy and capitalist diversity. Christoph Szombati, PhD CEU, former founder of Hungary's Green LNP party. He's a research fellow at the moment at the Max Planck Institute for Social Anthropology, Halle. Well, his research focuses on the intersection of class, race, politics, Eastern Europe, in particular Hungary, but increasingly also the region as such. He will talk about his book, so I'm not going to say anything about that. Mary Taylor is Assistant Director of the Center for Place, Culture and Politics at the Graduate Center of CUNY. She's an anthropologist, an urbanist, and an artist. And her research focuses on sites, techniques, and politics of civic cultivation, social movements, and governance, the ethics and aesthetics of nationalism, people's movements in the interwar socialist and post-socialist Hungary. Mary also co-edited Co-Revolutionary Praxis. Mary is clearly the only revolutionary in our group. Very happy she's there. Mary also co-edited Co-Revolutionary Praxis, Accompaniment as a Strategy for Working Together. She has taught at Hunter College, Cooper Union, Parsons School of Design, And she's on the editorial collective of Left East. I should perhaps also say that this is being recorded for Left East, and it will be up there rather soonish. Now the word goes to Attila.
Thank you for having me. Just a minute, I'm sharing my screen. And here we go. I hope so. Okay. So thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure and honor being here. And I will to speak about my book, The Rise of Hungarian Populism, Statocracy and the Orbán Regime. So I would like to speak about some words about the background of my book and a few assumptions on that, the historical matters, the theoretical investigations, populism and neoliberalism, and the constitutionalizing tendencies inside the Orbán's regime. And even my book has been published in 2019. I hope it is not old-fashioned and outdated, so I would like to speak about some words on the COVID-19 situation and how the perspectives of my book can be applicable in the current Hungarian situation. We have spoken about that. I'm a political scientist, the shame on me, but I'm trying to do my best to apply the political economist and political economical perspectives on this book. As it has been mentioned, it has been published in 2019, and after that I'm trying to create a new project to continue this to this book and investigate the COVID-19 situation and post-COVID situation in Hungary. The first point is about the political history or the historical perspective of populist regime. So this book is based on the assumption that the populism needs to be investigated in historical scales. In the book, several predecessors of the Orbán regime, for instance, Horthy regime, the communist populism, and anti-populist zeitgeist of Eastern European regime changes are analyzed. And it's very, very important to my investigation that there is no populist research or populist investigation without put a huge emphasis on the historical predecessors and historical background of Eastern European populist regime. The second point goes to theoretical side of my book. I'm convinced that it's also very important to put an emphasis on the political theoretical background of contemporary populism. What has been done in this book is a critical investigation of the populism of the Orbán regime, and I have found that there are several theoretical bases of regime. So there is an ideological and political theoretical patchwork behind on that. For instance, the renaissance of Carl Schmitt, using Carl Schmitt and Max Weber to create contemporary populist regimes. The Weberian leader democracy, populist constitutionalism are the main theoretical backgrounds on that. And it is also very interesting that the right-wing populism ideologically occupied some left-wing political theories, for instance, the Gramscian hegemony theory and the Laclau's populist assumption. It's a very, very interesting phenomenon that pundits behind the Orbán regime started to acquire these left-wing tendencies. The third point is about populism and neoliberalism. Orbán regime is not just a product of declining liberal democracy, given the fact it is financed by the EU's neoliberal framework, especially by the German automobile companies. Hungary has become some kind of good province of the neoliberal empire. In this book, I argued that the hegemony of authoritarian neoliberalism and the right-wing populism are both based on Gramscian theory of hegemony. It seems to be embracing that, on the one hand, Orbán's regime has been criticized by the EU bureaucracy. On the other hand, it has been financed by the EU's framework. But it reveals the deep tensions inside the liberal democracy and neoliberal capitalism. The cooperation of authoritarian neoliberalism and authoritarian populism is not a new phenomenon, but the Hungarian example is unprecedented because it is the very first case when an authoritarian neoliberal, and the authoritarian regime was able to create and unfold in the framework of authoritarian, in an authoritarian state in the EU. The Orbán regime has abandoned not just the liberal rule of law, but all the social commitments of welfare state in order to meet the expectation of neoliberal capitalism. The next point is about the mentioned constitutionalizing perspective. I put an emphasis on the book on the exceptional measures used by the Orbán regime during and after the migration crisis of 2015. Such authoritarian populist structures as the Orbán regime can be seen as some kind of rebirth of post-war Carl Schmittian politics. In my view, it is a contemporary authoritarian populism which is a real incarnation of constitutional dictatorship elaborated by Carl Schmitt. The Third Reich was established on the continuous extension of state of exception, which didn't match with the Carl Schmittian requirements. It is to say that the modern authoritarian populism, especially the Orbán regime, not just prolong the exceptional governance, but rather transform the legal and political system as a whole according to the demands of constitutional dictatorship, but at the same time, the exceptional politics remains unavoidable. That's why it is so crucial to understand how Orbán's regime institutionalized and constitutionalized itself. And it's very, very remarkable, and rely on the my project after this book, the several kinds and overlapping kinds of state of exception. The Orbán regime, upon the case of migration crisis, introduced and prolonged the state of exception in legal terms. The government introduced a state of emergency caused by mass migration in 2 southern counties in Hungary in 2015. In this way, the government introduced the state of exception without any real basis and centralized every exceptional power. The regime extended the local state of exception to nationwide, and the crisis caused by mass immigration has constantly been prolonged until in this year, until September 2021. So there are overlapping state of exception in Hungary because the refugee crisis induced exceptional measures have constantly been forced during the first phase of the pandemic crisis. In line with the waves that have unfolded since the outbreak of the COVID-19 crisis, the Hungarian government has declared 3 state of exceptions due to the coronavirus situation, 2 in 2002 and 1 in 2021. Each extraordinary period was associated with the so-called empowerment laws, which are especially authorization of the incumbent Hungarian government by the parliament. It is an authorization to implement long-term governments by decrees. And it's very remarkable that not just these 2 kinds of state of exception exist in Hungary, but in the last year, the government declared a very specific healthcare state of emergency in Hungary. So in the last 2 years, there have been 3 kinds of state of exception in parallel in Hungary. And some kinds of application of my book in the current Eastern European and Hungarian situation, the COVID-19, the neoliberal measures, and authoritarian populism. Orbán has found a way to advance political aspiration that do not serve to tackle the pandemic, but to build the post-pandemic Hungarian in his image. The regime has already started to implement its political agenda under the cover of epidemiological measures. For instance, stripping powers from the Hungarian majors and municipalities, take the control back from the municipalities, classifying public data, and so on and so forth. So the Orbán regime has always been much more afraid of the economic consequences of the crisis than of its epidemiological consequences. The neoliberal and state capitalist approach have always been decisive after 2010. strengthening the private sector, private healthcare sector. A significant part of Hungarian doctors and nurses work abroad. In addition, the regime began to dismantle the universal insurance system and expelled the poorest people from the healthcare service. So this embedded neoliberal atmosphere remained essential from the outbreak of the coronavirus crisis, and the most governments' economic measures are about to save the employers and the capital instead of direct help and protect of the working people. Across Europe, from the very first moment, the state is helping with wage subsidies to avoid a mass unemployment, except Hungary. This attitude has already resulted in significant social tensions, the hopelessness of the coronavirus unemployed people. The tax exemption for small businesses and the moratorium on loans will hardly enough to save the hundreds of thousands of Hungarian workers who lose their jobs and have no savings. While this rigor may be surprising, it fits, or exactly fits, into the regime's neoliberal workfare concept, which has been introduced by Orbán in 2014 as a counter-concept of social welfare system. And it seems to be that the epidemic crisis is an excellent opportunity to eliminate the remnants of the welfare state in Hungary. Epidemiological, health, and social destruction show that increasingly authoritarian nature of the system, but at least as a tragic in the economic crisis management program put together by the Orbán regime. So the essence of this is a neoliberal politics, which main goals is to directly help capital and large corporations, while the state provides directly help to workers only as a last resort. Behind this is the rather hypocritical white capitalist statement of the Orbán regime, which is, that is a quote, "There is no going back to a social aid-based economic," quote ends. So in an authoritarian system serving the interest of capital, any help for working class can only reach workers through the filters of capitalism. So thank you for your attention, and thank you for questions, comments, and so on. Thank you for this.
Fantastic. Thank you, Attila. I think I just take over and continue. So we are doing this in alphabetical order. That's how it's decided. I just thought I'd let you know. So let me also share my screen. All right. So as Don has already introduced me, I am at the Bocconi University at the moment, but I'm also a recovering politician, just like Christoph. I've been an MP between 2010 and 14, and part of the reason for writing this book was to try to make sense of what was what has happened to Hungary from two perspectives. First, I think at that point we failed to come up with a successful progressive green left alternative, and we were all quite surprised how quickly Viktor Orbán's regime was entrenched and by the stability of this regime. So this is kind of for me to say farewell to active politics, but I'm of course still engaged with politics in various ways. So this is the context of the book. And as I mentioned in the introduction, and Don also pointed this out, Hungary has been seen as a kind of an experiment, a laboratory experiment that was supposed to prove the end of the history. So that this is from the EBRD's transition report published in 1999, which shows this prevalent image that the more economic liberalization you have on the x-axis, the more democracy you will have. So this summarizes Fukuyama's thesis on the end of history. But we all know that then this guy came and he sort of turned history on its head. I was always looking for an opportunity to do this with PowerPoint, and now I finally got to do it. So there are quite a few books already and numerous, perhaps around 100 articles published about illiberalism in Hungary. But the way I see it, and they help us understanding what is going on. But in some ways, they represent the continuation of the same paradigm that I presented in a previous slide, and doesn't help us really understand how liberalism collapsed and why this is so that illiberalism is so robust in the country. And authoritarian populism and illiberalism is most often blamed on two kinds of actors. First, on political rogues, what I call in the book political rogues. So these are reckless politicians who are willing to break the norms of illiberalism. But then this raises the question why sort of good politics was successful and bad politics unsuccessful before 2010. So we need to understand the political opportunity structures within which political rogues operate. And the other is blaming workers who are hampered by their dysfunctional culture. We hear about civilizational incompetence, servant mentality, or other kinds of cultural explanations that are deeply rooted in the history of the electorate, especially the working class. But then this raises the question why there was no demand for illiberalism before 2009. And actually, survey research shows, and I show this also in the book, that Hungarians in many ways were more liberal than many other Eastern European countries, but also more liberal than some of the Western European countries in some dimensions. So I don't think that this offers a robust explanation. And on top of that, business and economic elites are very often portrayed as victims. And I just wanted to show you one example about this prevalent discourse about the cultural roots of illiberalism, which I think is just so telling. This is from 1993 by Piotr Stomka. You know, this is an important quote because he has been also the president of the International Sociological Association. So his views are quite influential out there. And he wrote an article about why the transition has slowed down, so why Eastern Europe hasn't democratized enough. And he says that it's because of the deep cultural legacy and the fake modernity imposed by real socialism, which leads to which is rooted in a kind of civilizational incompetence. So cultural deficiencies, lack of entrepreneurial culture, civic culture, discourse culture, everyday culture. And then he thought that the agents that would be able to undermine this kind of civilizational incompetence must be sought among the elites, most insulated from the impact of real socialism and at the same time most exposed to the influence of modern Western culture. So I think this is really beautifully summarizes one of the most powerful discourses about democracy, democratization, and then also about illiberalism in the region. And one of the aims of my book is to challenge this kind of reading. And the book's contribution is key contribution is to shift the focus from political rogues and dysfunctional culture to the local consequences of mismanaged dependent development, foregrounding the rise of illiberalism among the working class casualties of the industrialization and the national bourgeoisie peripheralized by transnational investors, identifying Orbán's regime as an accumulative state that rests on the new illiberal caste compromise with national and transnational capital. So I look at it from a quite similar angle as Attila, but what I do perhaps in different ways, looking at it deeply from the social roots and presenting quite a detailed empirical analysis about the roots of illiberalism in the country. And I look at two processes in particular. One is how economic disintegration paved the way to the rise of economic nationalism, especially among the national capitalist class in Hungary. So I can't get into the details. In the book, I present a detailed economic analysis using various kinds of macro data about this, how dependent development, mismanaged dependent development led to economic disintegration, how this polarized economically, leading to a kind of peripheralization of national capital as opposed to the all-powerful transnational capital, and how this paved the way for a kind of a revolt of the national capitalists, which allowed them to be incorporated and co-opted into Viktor Orbán's illiberal project. And I also show the political sides of this story by revealing the revolving doors between political economic elites, so that different sides of the political class, left, liberal elites and the conservatives, how they develop different kinds of connections to various segments of the economic elite, and how in particular the national capitalists have developed their ties to Viktor Orbán's regime. And the other story that I analyze in the book is how social disintegration paved the way for working class neo-nationalism. Again, I use 2 types of analysis. One is using economic macro data, but I also did 82 interviews with workers in Hungary, Strasbourg, to show how a kind of economic anger in the lack of a democratic integration of the working class and in the lack of a progressive left-wing political identity led to a rise of working class neo-nationalism. So here I combine kind of the geography of the industrialization and the political history of the failure of the left to articulate a left-wing social democratic identity, and how this paved the way from the kind of economic anger perceived by workers to be expressed through the language of neo-nationalism, which is again something that could be exploited by Viktor Orbán. And this graph presents a convoluted summary of my book, but here I just want to focus you on the last part. And I want to highlight that even though workers were crucial for the success, the political success of Viktor Orbán in 2010, as Attila already highlighted, they aren't really among the biggest winners. They are better off in some ways than previously under the neoliberal era, but they are also exploited even more in many other ways. And so I think that there is a need for political containment of the economic victims of this kind of regime, which rests on a new class compromise between national and transnational capital and the nationalist part of the political class. So the way I see the biggest innovation of Viktor Orbán is that he emancipated quite a broad segment of the Hungarian national capitalist class and invited them into the ruling power coalition. And he did this by introducing all kinds of measures, economic and social policy tools, instruments to accelerate capital accumulation. And of course, this polarizes society. Hungary is now the most unequal country in Central and Eastern Europe. And there are many other dimensions in how this polarizes society. And I also analyze this in the last chapter of the book. And I think some of the authoritarian technologies that Viktor Orbán uses, and I identify 2 technologies. One is authoritarian institutionalism and the other is authoritarian populism. So one is kind of a more harder side of populism, institutional reshuffling, and the other is a soft side of populism, the battle for people's hearts and minds. So the way I see this is partly the political function that they serve is to contain another revolt among the victims of the regime and to bolster this kind of new accumulative regime that really benefits the national and bourgeoisie and also quite a big segment of the transnational capitalist class. So to conclude, the way I see it is that, of course, neoliberal disembedding during the 90s and 2000s was crucial for the rise of Viktor Orbán. But in many ways, he rides the same wave of neoliberalism, but he changes it in many ways and embeds it in a nationalist populist discourse and the national populist institutional structure to consolidate some kind of exclusionary neoliberal political strategy that is designed to emancipate, most importantly, the national capitalists, but also benefiting international capitalists in many ways. So don't believe those analysts who say that everyone else is losing except for the smallest circle around Viktor Orbán, because in fact the economic elites and the upper segment of the middle class is in fact financially and economically better off under Viktor Orbán. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks, Gabor. And I'll jump right in and take over from you. So if you saw perhaps on Gabor's last slide that we actually worked together and have theorized together or thought together about basically Viktor Orbán's success in stabilizing this illiberal regime in Hungary. So in many ways, our work is complementary, but if I wanted to make a distinction, my work is more about rural areas, which I think are also very, very important for understanding, well, first of all, the unmaking of left liberal hegemony. And actually most of my books looks at this particular process, but also for understanding the success of Fidesz right now politically. Because if you look at actually the hegemonic coalition, the electoral alliance, and the wider societal constituencies underpinning this regime, the cornerstone or of this support is in the provinces. And that's partially why my work has been centered on the provinces. So I will also try to launch my presentation. Give me a second and I just want to make sure that you see this. Is it showing? Yes, okay, thank you. So my book is called The Revolt of the Provinces. And in many ways, it's similar to perhaps the work that you may be aware of or familiar with from the US. There are two people who I think whose work is, I should cite. One is Kathy Kramer, who worked on Wisconsin. She has a book on rural consciousness in Wisconsin in the Walker era, so pre-Trump era, which I think has a lot of resonance with my work here. And the other is Arlie Hochschild's work, Strangers in Their Own Land, which is more in the American South, but also deals with very similar phenomena, basically how a progressive neoliberal politics lost its support in rural areas, which bore the brunt of restructuring processes. So my book looks at what were these particular restructuring processes in Hungary. But so why the focus on Roma and anti-Gypsyism? And I would like to start with that. If you look at the elections of 2010, what really happened there is a political earthquake. Most of the story that's been told in the media is about the rise of Fidesz, but if you look at this graph, you'll see that actually support for the right, of course, was larger in 2010 than in 2006. Sorry. The big story is the collapse of support for the Socialist Party and the rise of a far-right party, Jobbik. And this particular party, Jobbik, the focus of its politics was really about Roma. And what it presented was a new narrative, what I call a racist redemptive narrative on Roma, who went from being poor brother or poor neighbor to becoming dangerous other and undeserving other. And what I was trying to understand, and this is an ethnographic research that I conducted, I think that's one of its particularities in rural areas, more particularly in northern Hungary, is why post-peasantries and worker peasantries became very disillusioned with the liberal elite and also angry and scared of Roma. And so here I would like to introduce you to Mr. Szoboszlai Barna, who is, I think, one of the key figures of this really series of cascading events that took place in the span of 4 years, 2006, 2010. Until 2006, Roma in the plural really had, well, first of all, no real political voice in Hungary, but also were not the objects of political discourse. They were really on the margins of politics. In 2006, you had a number of key events, and I can't explain to them here, but that really slowly led to the emergence of the gypsy in the singular as representing a threat to the well-being of the national community as a whole. And if you look at this gentleman on this picture, I think part of the story that my book tells is actually, some elements of it are here in this picture. The man sitting behind, so the older man, whose name is Barna, became infamous for, well, inadvertently killing thieves who came to take cucumbers from his garden, and he had built a fence and put electricity into it. And one of the thieves unfortunately touched that wire and died. This was a Roma neighbor of his who lived in the same village. And this became a huge story in 2008. If you look at the newspaper that it's in the middle of this frame, you see a gentleman who is a regional mayor who shakes his hands with Barna. He launched a political party focusing the need to restore order in the countryside. There's this word order in that picture. And actually later, the far-right party Jobbik became the main party that promoted this kind of politics of law and order in the countryside. And more particularly talking about gypsy criminality through stories that resembled this one that I'm presenting you here. So this is just one singular event, but there were really literally dozens and hundreds in Hungary at the time that were being promoted by right-wing personalities, far-right militants, and also right-wing intellectuals. And my book does two things. It basically, if you look at the blurb, it says it's the first ethnographic investigation of far-right politics and its success. But really, if I wanted to lay its or to pinpoint its focus, it's really the micro foundations of right-wing hegemony that it looks at. So I'm trying to understand the spread of racist sensibilities in this particular area, and also revealing the role of intellectuals, activists, and politicians in the transformation of popular racism, which really exists everywhere all the time, into a politicized anti-Gypsyism that takes a key role or plays a key role in local politics. And so the first part of the research, and I try to be quick here, and it really seeks to answer one particular question: what made the far right's racist redemptive vision of Roma credible and desirable in the eyes of rural citizens? And to do this, I conducted ethnographic research in two locales. So you see on this map, actually, my main site was in northeastern Hungary, called Gyöngyöspata. I just want to show you a few pictures of this village so you get an idea of it. It's a village which has an important historical ethnotourism. It plays a very important role in this village, building on local traditions and winemaking in particular. The Catholic religion also plays a very important role. And you see from the pictures that there's a very, very large divide between two emergent social classes here. That's what I wanted to portray. One of them is the local what I call the post-peasantry, people who try to make a livelihood, their livelihoods based on the land, particularly viticulture, because this is in the foothills of the Matra region. And what I call the surplus population, if you look at the bottom left part of the picture, you see these shabby houses who belong to mostly Roma, poor, who are socioeconomically deprived. And so I conducted research in these two villages in the span of 2 or 3 years. And what I really do is extended case studies for a voice theory. And I also have to mention here that Don was my supervisor. So I also drew a lot on his research in the Netherlands and his theorization of class. And there are basically two findings that I think are important as a takeaways from this particular field work that I conducted. One is really the importance of depeasantization and de-agrarianization as structuring forces in these depressed neighborhoods. So really these had very, very important consequences. They led to the decline of the rural economy in two phases, first 1990, then after the accession to the EU, so after 2004, and viticulture really bore the brunt of both of these restructurings. First because of the collapse of the Soviet markets, and then because cheap export wine arrived from Italy and other countries into Hungary. And this led to the dissipation of material security and the increasing reliance of these local surplus populations on the local community. The consequences of that was that previously existent patron-client ties between the Roma and post-peasants dissipated, and Roma basically started relying on petty theft and other and local state handouts to make their living and to ensure their social reproduction. And what made this especially problematic in this time was that in the previous 10 years, there had been a massive neoliberal policy of state retrenchment, which led to the bifurcation of the social policy in Hungary, and basically leaving poor people who were shut out from the formal economy, dependent on local communities. So basically left to prey on local communities, both in terms of ensuring their reproduction, their basic survival, but also in terms of their social mobility, so for schooling. And these led to a series of local conflicts that I explore in the book, which really became violent in this around the time of 2008, 2009, when the far-right party also arrived to this village and other villages to conduct patrols and antagonize and polarize this community along ethnic lines. So I think the main consequence of this combination of depeasantization and the unmaking of the welfare state was the preponderant feelings of abandonment in relation to the left-wing liberal elite, who felt increasingly distanced from the elites and increasingly angry with people who they saw as undeserving, who were being held by this elite. So this was a very unhappy combination of emancipation politics and neoliberal state retrenchment, what we could call, following Nancy Fraser, progressive neoliberalism. And the next part of the project, and here I'll be quick and I'll finish, focused on trying to understand the discourses and the key players that played a role in the production of this new redemptive racist discourse in the Northeast, and how then it spread from local areas and then regions, the Northeastern region, up to how it was scaled up to the national level. And in this I rely on discourse analysis and social movement studies. And what's really important to see is that they were actors on each of these scales levels who basically worked in tandem to produce this discourse, this abstract discourse of Roma representing a threat to hardworking Hungarians and such. You had local council elites who saw no place for Roma in their project to revive ethnic traditions and tourism. You had regional mayors who saw people turning increasingly against Roma, who wanted them to get themselves reelected, who broke with the Socialist Party, and increasingly, as I showed in that picture with Mr. Soboslai Barna, started to promote anti-Gypsyism as a political story. And then you had these far-right paramilitaries arriving in these regions with a deliberate aim to antagonize and polarize these communities. And lastly and finally, you had, I haven't mentioned this, but the Fidesz party, whose intellectuals and whose journal and whose newspapers played a major role in bringing these local events and abstracting them from their local contents and presenting them as this big story of how Roma are preying on Hungarians and how the liberals are not doing anything about it. So this is basically, if you read the book, most of the book is about the period running up to 2010. So why the left basically lost the countryside. But in my ulterior research, which if you are interested in, you can ask questions, of course, about, I tried to see and explain and analyze how Fidesz reacted to this revolt of the provinces and introduced a wholly new workfare regime and policy regime to keep these particular constituencies, post-peasants and worker peasantries, on its side. So thanks for your attention, and I pass the floor back over to Mary. And sorry, I just need to stop sharing. Yes.
Sorry, everyone, I've lost my text. Okay, here we are. Greetings, everyone. Can you hear me? Yes, okay. Greetings from New York City. It's a little loud outside, so I hope that there won't be too much interference. I do wish we were all in Cluj together. I want to thank Sorin and all the people at the Institute for Social Solidarity for making the conference possible, and Gabor and Christoph for organizing the excellent panel and inviting me to join. I am not giving a PowerPoint, so I've given you a little bit of historical eye candy to look at behind me. I'm a little bit in its way. My book, Movement of the People, Hungarian Folk Dance, Populism and Citizenship, has the distinction in this group of being the last to be published, but I believe the earliest to have been written. Although the book, which will be out in October, is changed somewhat, it was largely written by 2007, after my 2004-2005 fieldwork. And it reflects a moment in which it might have been hard to believe what has happened since. So while I was identifying things in 2004 and 2005 that were in some ways predictive of what has come, the book was written with a hopeful nuance that might even seem alarming to some readers today. At the same time, the earnest lovers of a really beautiful folk culture, and especially folk music and dance, whom I write about will, I'm afraid, feel totally misrepresented. My book is a historical ethnography of Hungarian folk revival, built around fieldwork with the Táncház folk dance revival movement between 2000 and 2005. It takes a historical materialist approach to the production and reproduction of something called the people, the nép, via those movements, népi, who champion the folk. While people and nation are often used interchangeably, my historical approach on how these two concepts are linked in different ways and also with state formation at different conjunctures. I argue that the Táncház movement, built on the associative forms of the dance event and tourism to Transylvanian villages, cultivates political personhood. I should say rather that Táncház participants cultivate in themselves a political personhood that is in relationship to the shifting political and economic conditions, while also building on institutions, practices, and ideologies with longer histories. I examined the anti-liberal expression that was palpable in Táncház during my fieldwork period in the context of the so-called transition to capitalism, and query how it reproduces ideas of the people and the nation that are both ethnicized and territorialized, and the ways that they are politicized. I set the revival movement that arose in the 1970s in historical context, examining its institutional precedents in earlier practices of folk dance revival, particularly those of the interwar agrarian populist NEPI movement and its ethico-aesthetics of folk national cultivation. I detail the specifics of its emergence, despite its claims to be oppositional, in state socialist cultural institutions, specifically the Institute for Culture and the system of culture houses, which were designed to cultivate socialist citizens. I examine how the movement transformed old institutions and built new ones in fluxing relationships with the transforming state and the economic system. I discuss how the spatialized practices of dance, association, and village tourism to Transylvania contribute to an emotionally charged, embodied, and territorialized collective memory of Hungarianness, a framework of sense that informs political personhood. While this collective memory is produced through similar technologies as those of the interwar populist movement, current events at different conjunctures shape the meaning of the folk and the related binary of folk and urban, népi urbanus, and its many variants. We can fill those variants in later when we discuss, if you'd like. While in the field, regularly frequenting Táncház in 2004, I identified a polarization underway in this associative space, which reflected and reinforced the political polarization taking shape in Hungarian society. The insistence that talking about politics was inappropriate in an environment in which anti-liberal, anti-socialist, anti-communist, and anti-Semitic expression was common appears to have reinforced a rightist character, if not participant base, and articulation, Stuart Hall would say, to the right. While some people stopped frequenting Táncház, others chose to tolerate growing ethno-nationalist expression in the context of the revival, some even finding the ones who complained or left to be intolerant. The political personhood cultivated in Táncház was also apparent at this time in relation to the referendum on dual citizenship for over-the-border Hungarians, when Táncház participants went out to vote yes, precisely because of their relationship with ethnic Hungarian Transylvanians and their geography and culture, which centrally informed the dance, communicative, and travel repertoires of the movement. They judged those who did not vote yes, whether abstaining or not, as un-Hungarian. Today's panel is, of course, focused on the political economy of the crisis of liberalism and the rise of illiberalism. Against the backdrop that Gabor's book offers, the rollout of market fundamentalist projects since the 1980s, the book touches on the specifically anti-liberal sentiment, which bleeds together with anti-communist, anti-socialist, and anti-Semitic elements, came to be cultivated in Táncház in the 15 years following 1989. Yet I argue that understanding the formation or reproduction of particularly ethno-national impulses in Táncház requires us to bring into view the global rise of culture talk and governance through culture since the demise of communism. Inspired by Mahmoud Mamdani's claim that the end of the Cold War is marked by the global ascendancy of a culture talk, which explains political events in terms of culture, I attempt to trace how Tanzas is tied to what George Giudice terms the expediency of culture by examining the movement's interactions with the neoliberal governance of the heritage regime, exemplified by UNESCO's programs to safeguard intangible heritage. While Hungary may be decried for its ethno-nationalism, it was rewarded in 2011 with the inscription of the Tanzas method onto the list of best practices for the safeguarding of intangible heritage. What might be particularly interesting for this conversation on political economy is that heritage, as a regime that defines cultural property and its owners, developed as a discourse on a similar timeline as neoliberalism, and it is tied up with the pursuit of tourism as a tool of economic development to address, for example, capital's flight from production. Focused on pluralism, the heritage regime, a liberal form of governance in the neoliberal era, works to cultivate discrete boundaries amongst groups understood as cultural and usually understood as ethno-national. In post-socialist Europe, this plays out in the context of shifts in property regimes and all the attendant processes of devaluation and revaluation related to capital accumulation and dispossession that have been underway since the so-called transition began. In this book, I do not give deep data on how culture of this sort is involved in capital accumulation and dispossession, but I attempt to sketch through some examples ways that heritage becomes the basis of monopoly rent, and how the fetishization of cultural practices necessary for this can be expedient to ethno-nationalist projects. There are important ways in which the culture talk meets up with new kinds of investments that make place and touch the sphere of social reproduction. Folk dance is, of course, an accompanier of rituals and traditional practices that have economic and social value. So just as liberalism and authoritarianism are said to be opposites, but we have seen how liberalism and neoliberalism have authoritarian tendencies, I think we have to note that liberalism is not necessarily the opposite of ethno-nationalism, even if it claims to abhor it. This brings us back to the languages of liberalism and illiberalism that are also central to our conversation today. People associate illiberalism with a number of negative things: the authoritarian state, ethno-nationalism, populism. Yet we are also chronicling the negative effects of the liberalization of a socialist economy. One thing I would love to touch on in our conversation is what it means to fall into a liberal, anti-liberal, or illiberal binary analytically as well as politically. Okay, I'll stop here. I'm looking forward to our conversation. Thank you.
All right. We have 4 fantastic books that together show us that we know much more at this point in time about the social origins of the neo-nationalist right, in particular in Hungary, than we knew 10 years ago. The books come together in placing that development. Of course, they focus all on Hungary. I'm a little bit frustrated by the absence of, sideways implicit comparisons. We focus strongly on Hungary, but we have very little time. The books also focus strongly on Hungary, but they tend to span out a little bit. We have global neoliberal capitalism and its class contradictions rolling out in different territories. In the case of Hungary, this was an extreme development, as Gabor sharing in particular emphasizes, which had deep consequences, as Christoph emphasizes, in particular also in the provinces and in the countryside. So the creation of the post-peasant surplus population is absolutely crucial for the development. In Hungary, it is also, perhaps not in its same dramatic forms, but it's also crucial, as far as I see it, to processes elsewhere. It's very difficult to explain the social origins of the rise of the new nationalist right anywhere without looking at the particular way in which these class contradictions of global neoliberal capitalism work themselves out in particular territories. So the crisis of social reproduction are very important. Now, we also have, in the case of Mary's book, the emphasis on neoliberal culturalism. I think that is a very important addition to this perspective, and it is sort of absent in the two books of Somebody and Sharing, even though it incorporates it, but it does not really mention it as explicitly as Mary does. So yes, after 1989, there was a global neoliberal development that created an explosion of liberal culturalism. So these things go together, as we know in the social sciences. So you produce unraveling class contradictions on the ground, and you emphasize at the same time the importance of social cohesion and culture and sharing, and the creation of strong culturally self-conscious groups, proud groups. And so neoliberal culturalism, with its emphasis on cultural human rights, was one particular way in which this happened, and that was incorporated in the local processes in all sorts of different ways. The viticulture entrepreneurs that Somebody looks at in the Matra region are probably also involved in heritage tourism, or in any case have friends that are involved in that. So here you have a sort of very organic set of local processes that are deeply globally inscribed. Now, the great thing, I think, of the books that we have here before us is that, in particular, Sharing and Somebody, and of course they work together, and they have worked together for a very long while. They were also together at CU when they started out as sociologists and anthropologists. Gabor was a little bit of an escapist from that, but yeah, what can we say? Is that on the one hand, you have this focus on the post-peasantries, and on the other hand, you get the working classes and the national bourgeoisie. And I think the real innovation in Gabor's book is how he connects the new nationalization of the dispossessed working classes in the Rust Belts in Hungary, together with the increasing restlessness and political mobilization of the national bourgeoisie around an ethno-nationalist right. Here you have so together, when you look at these books, you have the making of a very strong, and this is the big question that I want to pose to all of you, a very strong neo-nationalist class alliance going on in Hungary. Now, we should not overlook Attila's book here. Attila adds to this an aspect that is probably not sufficiently discussed in the other three books, and that is the sheer creativity of the new nationalist rights, which we have also, of course, also seen in the last years. You know, Trump, Boris Johnson, the Brexit, but also elsewhere, Italy, France, Carl Schmitt and Gramsci together. Right, so the incorporation of both left-wing traditions thinking about hegemony and right-wing traditions thinking about anti-liberal constitutionality, that is a very, very powerful intellectual development. The question, yeah, well, I think the final point that Attila has been making, that this is a permanent state of exception in Hungary. It's a regime of permanent exception. It's a constitutional dictatorship by now. I think he's entirely right about that. This is what Gabor also means when he says that Hungary is an avant-garde case. It goes further than anywhere else. In certain ways, you cannot really compare it with Poland anymore. I wonder how Attila thinks that, you know, when the pandemic serves to consolidate this regime over time, how he imagines the emergence of successful protests, successful openings, alternative openings in this. Because in his narrative, there is basically, there's no ending. So which particular contradiction emerges within this permanent state of exception in the present context of the pandemic and the health crisis and the ongoing economic crisis that is going to happen very soon? Which contradiction is the contradiction that might dislodge or in any case unravel it? Now, here's a question that I think all of you should want to deal with. Two of these books have populism in the title. The books by Somebody and Sharing don't have populism in the title. They talk about nationalism, I think, or in both cases. Can we actually still talk about populism in the Hungarian case? Does it make sense? What are the limitations of that? Should we not get out of that liberal discourse that accuses the populist of being populist? What is very clear, I think, from the Sharing and the Somebody book is that populism played a role in the mobilization, in the right-wing mobilization between 2006 and 2010. And perhaps in the first years too, and particularly in sort of anti-Gypsyism regime and the anti-crime regime, trying to create order. There was a particular populism still going on. But after 2015, when the focus in Hungary in this permanent state of exception was not anymore on the criminal gypsy, but shifted to the immigrants, and workfare was installed, is this still a populist regime? Or should we really see this as a regime that resurrects hierarchy? Now, if we conclude to that, hierarchy in its broad sense, right? Even in the new museum in Budapest, there is this recreation of a 19th century vision of an estate society. Hierarchy pervades the whole project, an elitist hierarchical project of national bourgeoisie formation, primarily in alliance with transnational capital and in alliance with a provincial working class that gets symbolically compensated. And fortunately, there's economic growth. So also, real wages are growing. But nevertheless, relationally and relatively, they are losing out over time. That's also what Attila shows and what Cobb shows. So now if we decide that the Hungarian case is primarily, after mobilization in which populism played a role, one of recreating hierarchy, can we still use the populism concept? Is there a populism that seeks hierarchy? I am not so certain of that, whether historically that makes sense. So this is a question to all of you. I can specify it a bit more for Mary. In the case of, so you have a long run history of NEP movements, of populist movements. Well, clearly in the 1930s, this was populist, democratic populist, emancipatory. But over time, in the conjunctural instances that you study, that particular populist meaning and element gradually disappears. And what is left in the end is ethno-nationalism. And it is probably also articulated ever stronger as a middle-class movement, as an urban middle-class movement, I guess, in ways connected with the heritage industry, no doubt. But perhaps the class bases are not so important in that. I think the thing that I want to ask you is whether, just like in the Hungarian regime itself in the present, we are dealing about hierarchy and not so much about populism. I think also from 2006 onwards, the populist element in the Tanzhaus and in the NEP kind of associations in Hungary disappears. It becomes ever more emptied down towards ethno-nationalism. A quick comparison with Poland, which I also know a little bit. when you look at family policies, which are of course pretty crucial in both cases, workfare in the Hungarian case, plus middle class social reproduction subsidies, punishing of the gypsies and of the subaltern poor, punishing of the immigrants. Poland is very different. That is still, I would say, a populism. So the only real enemy inscribed in the discourse of the social and the family policies in Poland are the postmodernists, are the gay movements, are the feminists. It's a conservative feminism, but as such, directly addressed to the provincial working classes and provincial lower bourgeoisies. The absence of historically of a strong Roma population in Poland has played a great role in keeping the PiS-like mobilization much more populist over time, I think, including in the regime that it has created, than in the case of Hungary. So these are questions for you. So populism, does it still make sense? Is it not rather hierarchy? Are these hierarchy-seeking movements in the end that install new 19th century-like, state-like forms of state formation? And in the case of Mary, is the NIP not emptied of its populist element and become ethno-nationalist? To Attila, what is the way out? I want not more than 2 minutes from each of you. Huh?
So thank you for this very interesting and very important questions and concerns. Just very briefly to take some time to Q&A session. First of all, you're totally right. It's a very, very important question, what's next? And because of the upcoming election in 2022, this is an open question in this time, because perhaps you have heard there is a opposition formation and there are new tendencies in Hungary. But it's a very, very interesting question, and just very briefly, and relying on Gabor perspective, because he distinguished the hard and soft structures, very, very interesting and important. And from a soft perspective, of course, it's a populist regime, but at least from the migration crisis from 2015, there is a biopolitical turn in the regime. There is an Agambanian, Carl-Schmittian turn, because this is a regime based on the permanent crisis and permanent war, permanent enemy creation. The first group of enemies was the refugees, and after that, the COVID-19 situation show that there is no consolidation in this regime. There was an expectation that the regime would come to an agreement with the opposition maybe in 2014, 2015, but the migration crisis and the COVID-19 crisis prove that there is no consolidation in this regime. And in this sense, I am very skeptical with the terms of illiberalism and illiberal. And it's very clear to me that this regime is not illiberal. This is anti-liberal, and there is an emerging fascism inside the regime. Take a look at the 9 constitutional amendments. Everything can happen in this regime from constitutional and political perspectives. So I would prefer the mentioned constitutionalized dictatorship terms to characterize the Orbán regime, and the COVID-19 situation proved that this permanent state of exception situation and the constant enemy creation emerged the biopolitical nature of this regime. And I am relying on the analysis of Nikos Poulantzas, who characterized very well in his famous book Fascism and Dictatorship the core nature such a regime as the Orbán one, because there is a cooperation, there is a pact between the high-level bourgeoisie, national bourgeoisie, and the petty bourgeoisie. So it's a very, very significant phenomenon in Hungary, as Gabor put an emphasis on that. That's on the one hand the working class or the middle class is the loser of the regime, but at the same time they have been exploited by the regime at a certain level. So it's I would say it's emerging fascism inside, and illiberalism is not the very best characteristic of the current biopolitical populist regime in Hungary, I would say. Thank you for that.
But you would still use the word populist for it?
Yes, I am. Yes, I mentioned that from soft perspectives, from political communication perspective. It's true. It's a populist regime, but as Gabor mentioned very well, hard tendencies and hard structure matter. So, from constitutional perspective, it's an authoritarian constitutionalized dictatorship. I would say.
Thanks.
Okay, if I may, I try to be as brief as possible because we will have to finish by 55 because there's going to be another panel after us. So we really have to hurry so that we have questions for time to answer audience questions. A very brief comment on populism. So in my book, I don't put too much emphasis on this term. I use authoritarian capitalism mostly and neo-nationalism to describe the culture and strategy, the culture of the working class and the strategy of Viktor Orbán. But I tend to use, when I use populism, I use it in a non-essential meaning. So I don't think that it has any particular content to it. If it makes sense to use it, it makes only sense to use it as a style of communication. And in that sense, as Attila said, it might make sense, but I always use it in combination with other adjectives if I am using it. So authoritarianism, authoritarian capitalism, and neo-nationalism, I think, are much more powerful theories that also capture the substance of the regime. But if you want to use populism as a kind of a discourse that pits elites and masses against each other, you might find evidence for this in the case of Hungary, but not in a sense of redistribution involving broad segments, kind of democratizing impetus. And this also leads me to my second question, comparing Hungary and Poland. And I fully agree with you, Don, that you can, if you want to compare the two countries, in many ways, Poland is more populist. If we think populism is something the way it emerged in Latin America, building on the masses and politics for the masses in some ways. I agree, and I would add that I also have an article coming out about this in the very near future that compares Poland and Hungary, and I show that. Because the national capitalist class has been weaker in Hungary and less integrated with other segments of the political class, illiberals or Viktor Orbán could claim monopoly over representing the national capitalist class. So this led to a very, very strong fusion in Hungary. In Poland, you don't have this kind of fusion because there the economic elite is very well embedded, with other kinds of parties as well. So PiS is not really pushing so strongly for representing the interests of the national capitalists as Hungary. And this is one of the crucial differences between the two countries, and it allows for more redistributive, if you want, populist policies in Poland. Thank you.
So I'll also try to be quick, not to lose too much time. Basically, Don, I agree with you. I think we have to go beyond the level of analyzing discourse, because if we stay at that level, we remain within the orbit of the ideology of the regime, basically. Of course, on that level, on the level of discourse, they do present themselves as populist, and they are very clever at these ideological maneuvers, playing against Brussels, right? Or playing against external threats, presenting themselves as the protectors of this small nation, a small island that is being invaded and dictated to. So they're clever at that, but we need to go beyond that to have any kind of credible analysis of our own. And what I would like to say from my own perspective, and just to say a bit back to, bringing the discussion a bit back to these hinterlands, is that what we're seeing is the emergence of a kind of paternalism or clientelism, definitely a hierarchical structure, in particular zones of abandonment, we could call them, in places where they haven't been able to construct their factories and push people into them through their neoliberal policy regimes, but where you still have these surplus populations. And what has happened in the last couple of years is, you mentioned it yourself, the introduction of a workfare program, which really, the effects of that really have to be emphasized. It really reintegrated these surplus populations into the local economy. But how? By basically placing these people under the tutelage of local mayors, who now have very important decisions about who will have access to this program. If you don't have access to this program, your social reproduction cannot be ensured, really. So people have to fight, these surplus populations have to fight for a place in the workfare program. And it's a soft kind of authoritarianism or paternalism, in the sense that the regime tries to make place for as many people as possible. So in the villages where I've looked at this program and where others have worked, from each family, one person gets to participate. But nevertheless, there's the threat of losing this opportunity. And what this does is it really, it makes you a secondary citizen. You are no longer, I don't think we can speak of proper citizenship. It really is a state of clientelism. And no wonder that Fidesz is wreaking a lot of votes in these regions. If you look at the distribution of the vote, it has shifted toward villages. Why? Because people in the workfare program are asked to vote for, first of all, the local mayor, but the local mayor is also part of this clientelist structure. So the mayor has to make sure that his people or her people, mostly his people, vote for the ruling party at the elections. So I think altogether, we have to analyze these hierarchies, as you say, and I would say these soft types of paternalism and clientelist practices and regimes in the countryside to understand the stability of the regime.
Okay, when I wrote the book originally, I used the term populist only to refer to the agrarian populist movement of the interwar movement, because at the time, populism wasn't such a catchphrase in political science and so on. And I've grown increasingly critical of the use of the language of populism over the years, because I think it obscures a lot, right? So this style of communication, it's argued that all politicians do it often. So what exactly populism is becomes a real problem. And I agree with our commenter in the chat that there's a kind of liberal anti-populism that does more work about reifying liberalism as the rational center than it does really to identify what these things are that are called populists. So with all that said, I think that Don, certainly I would say that Tanzhaz is mainly organized around ethno-national principles at the moment, but I would also point back to the NEPI movement of the agrarian NEPI movement in the 30s and say that although there is a certain type of class character to their program, land reform being a big one, supposedly for poor peasants, it very often gets kind of lumped in with fascism because of the ethno-national elements that were also present in that movement. So even if you can somehow say it's something other than ethno-nationalism, which I think there's a good argument for it. The kind of suturing of a hegemonic bloc, always, includes the use of that ethno-nationalism, I think. So, the picture behind me is of the 1930s in Szeged, and those are, in the arch are paintings dedicated to Horthy. So these things come together over and over again. So I wouldn't feel comfortable with saying it's more or less populist because of my problems with the language of populism. So I think maybe the more apt thing is kind of following on Christoph's point, is that the following through the types of clientelism that are being rolled out in relationship to this kind of like whatever structure of feeling around external homeland would be important. So one, there's the solidification of cultural institutions within Hungary that includes certain types of, folk art things. There's a consolidation of that. And then there are the various institutions that are being rolled out in quote unquote external homeland or over the borders that are also working through certain forms of clientelism with the very people that Tanzas reifies as the people, as part of the nation. So I guess I would leave it there so that we have more time to talk about other things.
Great, thanks everybody. I'm still on the microphone now. Yeah, so shall I lead the discussion then? So the floor is open.